The last coffee cup was still warm when Elijah Washington disappeared from the steps of the Lincoln Memorial. Population 599,657, the night of October 23, 2009, was shrouded in unseasonable rain that swept across the National Mall, turning the reflective pool into a rippling mirror of city lights. At 11:17 p.m., a security camera captured Elijah's navy blue sedan pulling out of the memorial parking lot, its taillights bleeding into the darkness before vanishing into the labyrinth of the Capitol's streets. Elijah, 29, a respected journalist for the Capitol Chronicle, was on his way to meet an anonymous source for what he believed would be the story of his career. By morning, his phone was dead, his apartment untouched, and concern quickly transformed into dread. In the weeks that followed, the city was torn between conspiracy theories, overlooked clues, and the unsettling sense that someone had deliberately silenced a voice that asked too many questions. What unfolded would haunt Washington, D.C., for more than a decade, shattering the Capitol's facade of security and raising questions about who truly held power in the corridors of influence. The disappearance of a man who dedicated his life to uncovering the truth would ironically become the city's most enduring mystery. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow, I've saved something extra special for you. On the night of October 23, 2009, Washington, D.C., settled into the familiar rhythm of a Friday evening. Rain tapped against window panes as government employees hurried home, and tourists sought shelter in museums and restaurants. The iconic monuments stood as silent sentinels, their white stone gleaming against the darkening sky. But that very night, an event that would ripple through the Capitol's consciousness began unfolding with terrifying quietude. Elijah Washington, 29, a rising star at the Capitol Chronicle known for his fearless investigative reporting, had spent his afternoon at the Lincoln Memorial Café. The barista later recalled his focused expression as he reviewed notes on his laptop, occasionally glancing at his phone as if waiting for a message. He ordered 3 espressos over 2 hours, she would later tell police. Said he needed to stay sharp for a meeting that might change everything. It was a simple observation, an ordinary detail in the steady life of a young man praised for his integrity and unwavering commitment to the truth. Around 11:10 p.m., Elijah packed his weathered leather messenger bag and left the cafe. The night was unseasonably cold, and security footage captured him zipping his jacket as he walked to his navy blue 2007 Honda Accord. A camera mounted near the Lincoln Memorial parking lot recorded his car pulling away at 11:17 p.m., turning toward Constitution Avenue. The dark sedan merged into sparse traffic, its driver unaware that this would be the last confirmed sighting anyone would have of him alive. After that, Elijah Washington vanished as if the sprawling city had swallowed him whole. No final text to his editor explaining his absence. No call to his sister with whom he spoke almost daily. No trace of his car anywhere in the district's extensive network of traffic cameras. Only questions remained, and a suffocating silence descended upon a city accustomed to constant noise and activity. On the morning of October 24, autumn sunlight struggled through clouds, casting muted shadows across the Capitol. In a modest brownstone apartment in Columbia Heights, Naomi Washington began her day with growing unease. Typically, her brother Elijah would have sent a late-night message about his latest investigation or called early to invite her for their Saturday morning ritual of coffee and conversation at Eastern Market. But her phone showed no missed calls, no texts, nothing but silence. She dialed his number repeatedly throughout the morning, each attempt met with the same outcome, immediate voicemail, suggesting his phone was either off or dead. Naomi told herself that perhaps he was deep into research or had fallen asleep at his desk, as he often did when pursuing a story with particular intensity. As noon approached with still no word, her concern crystallized into fear. At 12:30 p.m., she called Marcus Reed, Elijah's editor at the Capitol Chronicle, hoping he might have heard from him. "Naomi," Marcus answered, his voice immediately tensing when she asked about her brother. "I was about to call you." Elijah missed his 10 a.m. check-in, and he's never done that before. He was supposed to file notes on a major story this morning. "What story?" Naomi asked, her throat tightening. He wouldn't tell me specifics, said it was too sensitive. Just that it involved people in positions of serious influence, and he was meeting a source last night who had documents that would change the conversation about power in this city. The silence that stretched between them carried the weight of shared dread. Within the hour, Naomi was inside Elijah's apartment in Shaw, using the spare key he had given her years ago. Everything was precisely as it should be: dishes in the drying rack, bed made with military precision, his running shoes by the door. His laptop was missing, but his charger remained plugged into the wall. On his desk, a notepad showed indentations of hurried writing, but the page above had been torn away. By 2 p.m., Naomi and Marcus were sitting in the Metropolitan Police Department's 3rd District station. The desk sergeant took down details about Elijah, his car, and his last known movements. However, the initial response was measured and clinical, bordering on dismissive. "Ms. Washington, I understand your concern," the officer said, "but your brother is an adult who's been missing for less than 24 hours. He's a journalist, correct? They often keep irregular hours, especially when chasing a story." Naomi leaned forward, her voice steady despite her rising anger. "My brother has never gone dark like this. He always lets someone know where he is. It's a safety protocol he's followed since he started investigative work." "Something is wrong." The officer nodded, but his expression remained unchanged. "We'll file a missing persons report, but without evidence of foul play, there's limited action we can take immediately. He may simply be following a lead or taking some personal time." Marcus interjected, "Elijah Washington doesn't take personal time in the middle of breaking a major story. Not without telling his editor." Despite their protests, the initial report was classified as a voluntary absence, pending further information. This categorization infuriated Naomi but left her with few options. In the eyes of law enforcement, a journalist missing for less than a day didn't warrant the mobilization of significant resources, especially in a city where dozens of missing persons reports were filed weekly. That evening, Naomi and Marcus, along with several of Elijah's colleagues, began their own search. They retraced what they knew of his movements, starting with the Lincoln Memorial Cafe and expanding outward. They showed his photo to baristas, security guards, and anyone who might have seen him the previous night. At the cafe, they learned more about his final hours. He was agitated, the evening manager told them. Kept checking his phone and glancing at the door. Around 10 p.m., he got a text that seemed to change everything. His whole demeanor shifted, he became intensely focused, packed up quickly, and said something about finally getting the proof. When they reviewed the security footage from the memorial parking lot with a reluctant park ranger, they confirmed Elijah's car leaving at 11:17 p.m. The grainy black and white video showed him alone in the vehicle, turning east toward Constitution Avenue. After that, the trail went cold. Traffic cameras that should have captured his car's progress through the city showed no sign of the Navy Honda Accord. By Sunday morning, with still no word from Elijah, the tone of the police response shifted. Detective Grace Chin of the Major Case Squad was assigned, bringing a more urgent approach. The case file noted that Elijah Washington was not only missing but also a journalist potentially working on a sensitive story that might have made him a target. Detective Chin interviewed Naomi at length, asking detailed questions about Elijah's recent behavior, his work, and any enemies he might have made. "He's been different the past few weeks," Naomi admitted. "More cautious. He started varying his routes home, checking over his shoulder. I asked if he was in trouble, but he just said, 'Sometimes the truth makes powerful people uncomfortable.'" Chen's expression remained neutral, but she wrote rapidly in her notebook. "Did he mention any specific story he was working on? Any names?" "He was investigating campaign finance irregularities," Marcus explained, joining the interview. He believed he'd found a pattern linking several high-profile politicians to a network of shell companies. But he was methodical, wouldn't publish without irrefutable evidence. By Monday morning, Elijah's disappearance became public. The Capitol Chronicle ran a front-page story, "Award-winning journalist missing, Elijah Washington last seen Friday night." Local news channels picked up the story, showing Elijah's photograph, a serious young man with intense eyes and a slight smile, alongside footage of the Lincoln Memorial, his last known location. The public reaction was immediate and intense. In a city built on information and influence, the disappearance of a journalist raised profound questions. Was this related to his reporting? Had he uncovered something that someone wanted to keep hidden? Social media exploded with theories ranging from government conspiracy to personal vendetta. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel, it means a lot to us. Now back to the story. As word spread, volunteers formed search parties that combed Rock Creek Park, the tidal basin, and other areas where a car, or a body, might be concealed. Journalism organizations issued statements demanding a thorough investigation, and the National Press Club held a candlelight vigil on Pennsylvania Avenue, directly facing the White House. The message was clear: an attack on a journalist was an attack on democracy itself. Detective Chen's investigation accelerated, expanding beyond Elijah's immediate circle. She obtained warrants for his phone and email records, interviewed his sources, and reconstructed his movements in the days leading up to his disappearance. A troubling pattern emerged. Elijah had been researching a network of financial transactions linking 3 senators, a deputy director at the Treasury Department, and several real estate developments across D.C., Maryland, and Virginia. He believed he'd found evidence of money laundering, a colleague confided to Chen. Shell companies purchasing properties at inflated prices, then selling quickly at a loss. Classic patterns for washing dirty money. The amounts were in the millions. For days after Elijah vanished, a potential breakthrough came from an unexpected source. A parking attendant at a garage near the Watergate complex reported finding an abandoned navy blue Honda Accord on the facility's lowest level. The license plate had been removed, but the VIN matched Elijah's vehicle. Police swarmed the location, processing the car with meticulous care. What they found only deepened the mystery. Elijah's messenger bag was missing, along with his laptop and phone. The car's interior had been wiped clean of fingerprints, even Elijah's own. More disturbing was a small bloodstain on the driver's seat, later confirmed through DNA testing to be Elijah's. This discovery transformed the investigation from a missing person case to a presumed homicide. The media coverage intensified, with national outlets now following the story. The headline in the Washington Post captured the growing fear: journalist's disappearance sends chilling message to Fourth Estate. As October gave way to November, the investigation faced mounting pressure. Politicians called for transparency, journalists demanded answers, and Elijah's family endured the particular torment of not knowing. Was he alive? Had he witnessed something he shouldn't have? Was his body lying undiscovered in the vast wilderness surrounding the Capitol? Detective Chen focused on the financial trail Elijah had been following. She partnered with the FBI's white-collar crime division to unravel the complex network of transactions. What they found suggested that Elijah had been correct: millions of dollars were moving through an elaborate maze of shell companies, many registered to the same Delaware address. The beneficial owners of these companies remained hidden behind layers of corporate secrecy, but the pattern pointed to sophisticated money laundering. 6 weeks into the investigation, another critical piece emerged. A homeless man living under a bridge near the Anacostia River came forward after seeing Elijah's photo on a flyer. He claimed to have witnessed something disturbing the night of October 23. There was a dark car, fancy one, that pulled up near the river around midnight, he told detectives. 2 men dragged something heavy from another car and put it in their trunk. I thought it was drugs or something, so I kept quiet. But now I'm thinking it might have been a person. The location was less than 2 miles from where Elijah's car was found. Search teams with cadaver dogs combed the riverbank but found no evidence. However, the witness's description of the fancy car, a black SUV with tinted windows and government plates, added a new dimension to the investigation. When Detective Chen attempted to access traffic camera footage from the routes between the Lincoln Memorial, the Watergate Garage, and the Anacostia River, she hit an unexpected obstacle. The footage from multiple cameras along those routes was missing, allegedly due to a system maintenance issue that coincidentally occurred that night. This discovery sent a chill through the investigation team. It suggested not just a crime of opportunity, but a coordinated effort by someone with access to municipal systems. The question shifted from who would want to harm Elijah to who had the power to cover it up. By the end of 2009, the case had reached a frustrating impasse. Despite hundreds of interviews, extensive forensic work, and relentless media coverage, Elijah Washington remained missing. No body had been found, no arrests made. The blood in his car was insufficient to suggest a fatal injury, leaving open the possibility that he was being held somewhere, or that his remains had been disposed of with professional efficiency. For Naomi Washington, the uncertainty was unbearable. She took a leave of absence from her job as a public defender to focus entirely on finding her brother. She established the Elijah Washington Foundation, dedicated to supporting investigative journalism and advocating for journalists at risk. The foundation became a rallying point, keeping Elijah's case in the public consciousness when official attention began to wane. Marcus Reed ensured that the Capitol Chronicle continued Elijah's work, assigning a team of reporters to investigate the financial network he had been tracking. Their series, following Elijah's thread, won a Pulitzer Prize the following year, but the recognition was bittersweet. The story was being told, but the storyteller remained silenced. As winter settled over Washington, D.C., the city's usual rhythms resumed. The monuments stood stoic against the snow, tourists flocked to museums, and the machinery of government ground forward. But beneath this normalcy, a current of unease persisted. If a journalist could vanish without a trace, his disappearance seemingly orchestrated with precision, what did that say about the true nature of power in the nation's capital? The question hung unanswered in the cold winter air, a reminder that in a city built on truth and justice, both remained elusive for Elijah Washington and those who loved him. His empty desk at the Capitol Chronicle became a silent memorial, his byline absent from the pages where once he had given voice to the voiceless and challenged those who believed themselves beyond accountability. For Detective Grace Chen, the case became personal, a shadow that followed her through subsequent investigations. She kept a photo of Elijah in her desk drawer, a reminder of a promise not yet fulfilled. Sometimes cases go cold, her supervisor told her when resources were redirected. But they never close until we have answers. Chen's response became her mantra for the years that followed, then we keep looking for answers. No matter how long it takes or how high up it goes. Because someone knows exactly what happened to Elijah Washington. And eventually, the truth always finds its way to the surface. Years passed, and Washington, D.C., continued its endless cycles of political seasons. Cherry blossoms bloomed and fell, administrations changed hands, and new scandals emerged to capture the public's attention. Yet for those who remembered, the name Elijah Washington lingered like an unresolved chord in the symphony of the capital city. His case gradually slipped from front pages to occasional mentions, finally settling into the purgatory of cold case files, remembered but unsolved. From 2010 to 2015, the search for Elijah became increasingly isolated. His sister Naomi maintained the foundation bearing his name, holding annual press conferences on the anniversary of his disappearance. The crowds grew smaller each year, though a core group of dedicated journalists always attended, refusing to let one of their own be forgotten. Detective Grace Chen, now promoted to lieutenant, kept the case active in her personal files even as official resources dwindled. Each year, she submitted requests for new forensic testing as technologies advanced, most denied due to budget constraints and shifting priorities. The blood sample from Elijah's car, initially too small for comprehensive analysis, remained in storage, waiting for science to catch up with justice. Naomi Washington transformed under the weight of her brother's absence. Once a rising public defender with a promising career ahead, she redirected her legal expertise entirely toward journalist protection and freedom of information advocacy. Her apartment walls became a physical manifestation of her obsession, maps of D.C. marked with possible routes, timelines, photos of persons of interest, and scraps of information gleaned from various sources. "People think I'm dwelling in the past," she told a documentary filmmaker in 2014, her eyes reflecting both exhaustion and determination. "But for me, there is no moving forward until I know what happened to Elijah." This isn't about closure, it's about truth. And the truth doesn't expire. Marcus Reed, who had become executive editor at the Capitol Chronicle, ensured that Elijah's desk remained unoccupied, a silent memorial in the bustling newsroom. Each year, the paper ran a feature on the anniversary, updating readers on the state of the investigation and highlighting Elijah's unfinished work. His colleagues continued investigating the financial network he had been tracking, though many leads went cold or disappeared behind walls of corporate and political protection. Elijah believed that patience was the most important virtue in investigative journalism, Marcus told new reporters during orientation. The powerful count on public attention being short. They wait for us to move on to the next story. Our job is to outlast them. But despite these efforts, time took its toll on the case. Witnesses' memories faded, evidence degraded, and the trail grew colder with each passing month. By 2015, even Naomi admitted in private moments of despair that finding her brother alive seemed increasingly unlikely. The question had shifted from where Elijah was to where his remains might be found, and whether those responsible would ever face justice. In January 2016, a development in forensic technology reignited hope. A specialized lab in California had developed a new method for extracting and analyzing DNA from severely degraded samples, a technique originally designed for archaeological research but with promising applications for cold cases. Lieutenant Chin immediately submitted a request to have the blood evidence from Elijah's car tested using this new methodology. The results, returned 3 months later, confirmed what they already knew: the blood belonged to Elijah. But the testing also revealed something unexpected: trace amounts of DNA from a second individual, previously too minimal to detect. The profile was partial but sufficient to run through the FBI's Combined DNA Index System, CODIS. There was no immediate match in the criminal database, but Chin refused to let the lead die. Working with the FBI's Cold Case Unit, she advocated for expanding the search parameters to include familial DNA matching, a controversial technique that could identify relatives of the unknown person, potentially leading investigators to a suspect who wasn't in the system directly. The bureaucratic battle took nearly a year, with privacy advocates and legal experts debating the ethics of such searches. Finally, in December 2016, approval came through, and the partial profile was compared against the expanded database. The results stunned even the most seasoned investigators. The DNA showed a close familial match to Raymond Sullivan, a career diplomat who had served as deputy chief of mission at several American embassies before his death in 2012. Sullivan himself couldn't have been directly involved; he had been stationed in Turkey when Elijah disappeared. But the DNA suggested that a close biological relative, a sibling, child, or parent, had been present when Elijah bled in his car. This connection electrified the investigation. Raymond Sullivan had 2 children, a daughter serving as a physician with Doctors Without Borders, and a son, Victor Sullivan, who had worked in various government positions, including a stint at the Treasury Department during the period Elijah had been investigating. "This isn't just a break in the case," Chin told her team as they gathered in a conference room lined with evidence boards. "This is the thread that could unravel everything. Follow Sullivan, but keep it quiet. If he's connected to what happened to Washington, he has powerful friends." Victor Sullivan, 45, presented the picture of Washington establishment success. Harvard-educated, impeccably connected, he had moved between government and private sector positions with the fluid ease that characterized the Capitol's elite. Since 2013, he had served as a senior partner at Meridian Consulting, a firm specializing in government relations and international finance, with a client list that included several of the entities Elijah had been investigating before his disappearance. Surveillance on Sullivan began discreetly. His movements were tracked, his communications monitored when legally possible, and his past scrutinized for connections to Elijah's case. The investigation revealed a man living a compartmentalized life, the public face of respectability masking questionable financial dealings and associations with individuals known to operate in legal gray areas. Most significantly, financial forensics uncovered Sullivan's involvement with several of the shell companies Elijah had been investigating in 2009. His name never appeared on public documents, but complex transaction trails led back to accounts he controlled. The pattern suggested exactly what Elijah had suspected, a sophisticated money laundering operation channeling funds from both domestic and international sources into various political campaigns and real estate developments. In March 2017, the case took another dramatic turn. An anonymous source contacted the Capitol Chronicle through encrypted channels, claiming to have information about Elijah Washington. After careful verification protocols, Marcus Reed met the source, a former IT specialist who had worked as a contractor for various government agencies. "I was tasked with routine maintenance on the traffic camera network the week Washington disappeared," the source explained, voice barely above a whisper despite the noisy diner chosen for the meeting. "When I came across a deletion order for footage from specific cameras on the night of October 23, 2009, I thought it was routine. But the authorization code caught my attention. It came from a senior level at Treasury, not transportation." The source had kept a log of the deletion order, including the authorization code. Years later, connecting the dots after reading about the investigation into financial networks, they realized the significance of what they had seen. The code traced back to a terminal used by Victor Sullivan during his Treasury Department tenure. Marcus immediately shared this information with Lieutenant Chen, who incorporated it into the growing case against Sullivan. The evidence was still circumstantial, but the picture becoming clearer. Elijah had been investigating money laundering connected to Sullivan, who had both motive and apparent opportunity to silence the journalist. By summer 2017, Chen felt they had enough to bring Sullivan in for questioning. The approach needed to be careful. Confronting someone with Sullivan's connections prematurely could lead to political interference in the investigation. Instead, she opted for a strategy of gradual pressure, beginning with an interview framed as a routine follow-up on an unrelated financial matter. Sullivan arrived at the police headquarters in an impeccable suit, the very picture of cooperative confidence. "Lieutenant," he said, offering a firm handshake, "how can I assist the department today?" The interview room was deliberately chosen, not the harsh, intimidating box scene in television dramas, but a more comfortable space designed for non-confrontational conversations. Chen began with questions about Sullivan's work at the Treasury, gradually steering toward the financial networks Elijah had been investigating. "Mr. Sullivan," she said, keeping her tone casual, "during your time at Treasury, did you ever encounter concerns about certain real estate transactions in the district that might have indicated money laundering?" Sullivan's smile never faltered. "We reviewed thousands of suspicious activity reports. I can't recall specific cases without context." Chen nodded, then slid a folder across the table. Inside were documents showing the shell company structure Elijah had been tracking. "What about these particular entities? They seem to connect to projects you've been involved with at Meridian." A nearly imperceptible tightening around Sullivan's eyes was the only indication that the question had landed. "Lieutenant, Meridian consults on major development projects throughout the region. I'm not familiar with the specific ownership structures of every client's financing." The dance continued for nearly 2 hours, Chen laying out pieces of the puzzle without revealing the full picture, Sullivan deflecting with practiced ease. She never mentioned Elijah Washington, never gave any indication that Sullivan was a suspect in anything beyond financial irregularities. As the interview concluded, Chen made her move. "Just one more thing, Mr. Sullivan. We're reviewing some cold cases, and it appears your DNA might help us exclude some possibilities. Would you be willing to provide a sample? Purely eliminative, of course." Sullivan's composure slipped for just a moment, a flash of calculation crossing his features before the mask of cooperation returned. "I'm afraid that would require a warrant, Lieutenant. Nothing personal, just standard legal advice." "Of course," Chen replied, closing her folder. "We'll be in touch if we need to formalize the request." As Sullivan left the building, Chen knew they had him. An innocent man with nothing to hide would have no reason to refuse a DNA sample for exclusionary purposes. More importantly, Sullivan's reaction confirmed he understood the significance of DNA evidence, something he shouldn't have known if he had no connection to Elijah's case. The investigation accelerated. With Sullivan now alert to police interest, Chen obtained warrants for his financial records, phone data, and surveillance of his movements. A judge approved a DNA collection order, though Sullivan's attorneys immediately filed motions to block it, beginning a legal battle that would stretch for months. In October 2017, exactly 8 years after Elijah's disappearance, a critical breakthrough came from an unexpected direction. The Elijah Washington Foundation had established an anonymous tip line years earlier, most submissions leading nowhere. But a new message caught Naomi's attention immediately: check the preserve at River Bend. Northeast corner, where the old drainage culvert runs. I helped him bury something there in 2009. He said it was just evidence of financial crimes. I didn't know it was a person until years later. I can't live with it anymore. The preserve was a luxury housing development in Maryland, just outside D.C., one of the projects Elijah had been investigating for potential money laundering. Construction had begun in 2008 but stalled during the financial crisis, resuming in 2010 under new ownership, a shell company later traced back to Victor Sullivan's network. Naomi immediately forwarded the tip to Lieutenant Chen, who assembled a search team with ground-penetrating radar equipment. The area described was now part of a manicured community park, with walking trails and carefully landscaped gardens. The original drainage culvert had been incorporated into a more extensive water management system during construction. For 3 days, forensic technicians methodically scanned the area, working in sections to avoid attracting attention. On the third day, the radar detected an anomaly approximately 6 feet deep, a disturbance in the soil layers consistent with excavation and refilling. The excavation began at dawn the following day, carefully removing layers of earth under the watchful eyes of forensic anthropologists. 3 feet down, they encountered construction debris, concrete fragments, rebar, sections of PVC pipe, seemingly placed deliberately. Beneath this layer, wrapped in heavy plastic sheeting, they found what they had been searching for: human remains. The recovery took nearly 16 hours, every fragment documented, photographed, and carefully removed to preserve evidence. The remains were transported to the medical examiner's office, where preliminary examination confirmed what many had feared for years: they had found Elijah Washington. The cause of death was determined to be blunt force trauma to the skull, with secondary injuries to the ribcage and left arm, consistent with a severe beating. Soil analysis suggested the body had been treated with chemicals to accelerate decomposition before burial, a calculated attempt to destroy evidence that ultimately failed. Most crucial was a titanium dental implant with a serial number that matched Elijah's dental records, providing definitive identification. After nearly 8 years in the ground, Elijah Washington had been found, buried on the very property he had been investigating when he disappeared. The discovery sent shockwaves through Washington, D.C. Media outlets that had long since relegated Elijah's case to occasional mentions now led with breaking news alerts. The Washington Post headline captured the city's reaction: journalist found, Elijah Washington's remains discovered at luxury development he was investigating. For Naomi Washington, the confirmation brought a complex wave of emotions: the devastation of having her worst fears confirmed, coupled with vindication that her persistence had not been in vain. At a press conference held on the steps of the police headquarters, her voice steady despite her tears, she addressed the cameras: "Today we found Elijah. Tomorrow we find justice for him. My brother died because he believed the truth matters more than power or money or influence. The people who silenced him thought they could bury the truth along with his body. They were wrong." The discovery created new momentum for the investigation. With Elijah's remains recovered, forensic evidence previously unavailable now strengthened the case. Soil and plant material found with the body matched samples from the Sullivan family's Virginia estate, suggesting the body had been temporarily stored there before burial. Fibers embedded in fractures on Elijah's wrist bones matched an uncommon carpet installed in Victor Sullivan's Georgetown townhouse in 2009, later replaced during renovations. The DNA battle ended when a judge ruled that the discovery of the body created sufficient probable cause to compel Sullivan's sample. When testing confirmed the match to the trace DNA found in Elijah's car, prosecutors had enough to move forward. In December 2017, Victor Sullivan was arrested at Meridian Consulting's holiday gala, let out in handcuffs before Washington's political and business elite. The charges were devastating: first-degree murder, conspiracy, obstruction of justice, money laundering, and a host of financial crimes. The indictment painted a picture of a man who had orchestrated not just Elijah's killing but the extensive cover-up that followed, using his government position and connections to erase evidence and misdirect investigators. Sullivan's arrest triggered a cascade of revelations. Former associates, fearing implication, began cooperating with authorities. A driver came forward, admitting to helping transport a heavy trunk from Sullivan's townhouse to the Virginia estate on the night Elijah disappeared. A former security contractor confessed to disabling specific traffic cameras on Sullivan's instructions. Each revelation filled in another piece of the horrific puzzle. Most damning was testimony from James Mercer, Sullivan's former aide, who had sent the anonymous tip about the burial location. In exchange for reduced charges, Mercer provided a complete account of the night Elijah died. Sullivan arranged to meet Washington at the Lincoln Memorial, claiming to be a whistleblower with documents about the money laundering network. When Washington arrived, Sullivan and two hired men attacked him in the parking lot, forced him into his own car, and took him to Sullivan's townhouse. They beat him for information about what he knew and who he'd told. Sullivan was enraged, saying Washington had to be silenced before he exposed everything. When Washington lost consciousness from the beating, they realized he was dying. Sullivan panicked and ordered us to wrap the body and take it to his family estate until they decided what to do with it. 2 days later, we buried him at the preserve, where construction had been paused. Sullivan said no one would find him there, and once construction resumed, the site would be permanently altered. He made me help dig the grave. I've been trying to forget it ever since. As 2018 began, Washington, D.C., confronted the full implications of what had happened in their midst. A respected journalist had been murdered for investigating corruption that reached into the highest levels of finance and government. The subsequent cover-up had involved the manipulation of law enforcement systems, financial records, and evidence, all orchestrated by someone operating within the very institutions designed to protect the public interest. For Detective Grace Chen, now leading the Major Crimes Division, the case represented both her greatest achievement and a sobering reminder of how power could obstruct justice. 8 years, she told her team as Sullivan's trial approached. 8 years because he had the resources to hide his tracks and the connections to deflect scrutiny. But no matter how powerful the opponent, the truth eventually surfaces. In April 2018, Elijah Washington was finally laid to rest in a ceremony attended by hundreds of journalists, activists, and citizens who had followed his case over the years. The Capitol Chronicle published a special edition dedicated to his work and legacy, featuring the completed investigation he had begun nearly a decade earlier. His notes, preserved by Marcus Reed, had ultimately helped build the case against not just Sullivan but an entire network of corruption. As spring returned to the Capitol, bringing cherry blossoms and renewal, the long-cold case of Elijah Washington had thawed into a reckoning. For those who had kept his memory alive through years of uncertainty and dwindling hope, the discovery brought not just answers but affirmation, that persistence matters, that truth cannot be permanently buried, and that even in a city defined by power, justice may be delayed but not ultimately denied. Victor Sullivan's trial captivated Washington, D.C., throughout the summer of 2018. The courtroom, usually reserved for proceedings that barely registered in public consciousness, became the epicenter of a drama that exposed the Capitol's darkest undercurrents. Every morning, crowds gathered outside the federal courthouse, some holding signs with Elijah's photograph, others simply there to witness justice unfold in a case that had haunted the city for nearly a decade. Inside, the prosecution methodically built their case. Assistant U.S. Attorney Marissa Daniels, chosen specifically for her reputation of fearlessness against powerful defendants, laid out the evidence with surgical precision. The courtroom fell silent as she presented the timeline of Elijah's final hours, now reconstructed through witness testimony, forensic evidence, and financial records. Elijah Washington was murdered because he discovered the truth, Daniels told the jury in her opening statement. He found a network of corruption that reached from private boardrooms into the halls of government, and for that, he paid with his life. This case is about more than one man's death. It's about whether power and influence can place someone beyond the reach of justice. Sullivan's defense team, led by renowned attorney William Hayes, countered by attempting to create reasonable doubt. They argued that the DNA evidence was contaminated, that James Mercer was lying to save himself, that the financial transactions were complicated but legal. Hayes portrayed his client as a respected public servant being scapegoated for a cold case that authorities were desperate to solve. The prosecution has built a house of cards, Hayes argued, his voice resonating through the packed courtroom. Circumstantial evidence stacked upon circumstantial evidence, held together by the testimony of a man who admitted to helping bury a body, a man who only came forward when he feared discovery. But as the trial progressed, the defense's narrative unraveled. Financial experts testified about the elaborate money laundering scheme Elijah had uncovered. Forensic scientists explained how Sullivan's DNA was found in Elijah's car. Former colleagues from the Treasury Department described Sullivan's unusual interest in traffic camera maintenance schedules in the days before the disappearance. Most damaging was the testimony of Dr. Eleanor Wright, the forensic anthropologist who had examined Elijah's remains. With clinical detachment that somehow made her words more devastating, she detailed the injuries he had suffered: multiple blows to the head and face, defensive fractures to his forearms, signs of restraint at his wrists and ankles. The pattern of injuries indicates a prolonged assault, she testified, gesturing to X-ray images displayed for the jury. The victim was conscious in attempting to defend himself from much of the attack. Throughout this testimony, Naomi Washington sat in the front row, spine straight, eyes fixed on Sullivan. The man who had once fixed her mother's car, who had attended community meetings in their neighborhood, who had offered condolences after Elijah disappeared, now revealed as the architect of her brother's death. She never flinched, never looked away, even during the most graphic testimony. When it was her turn to take the stand, Naomi spoke with quiet intensity about her brother's dedication to truth, his methodical approach to investigating corruption, and the nearly 9 years she had spent searching for answers. Her testimony wasn't about evidence but about humanizing the victim, reminding the jury that behind the legal arguments and forensic details was a life deliberately extinguished. Elijah believed that journalism was a sacred trust, she said, her voice steady despite the emotion evident in her eyes. He used to tell me that in a democracy, the most dangerous thing isn't what people know, but what they don't know. He died because he refused to let powerful people keep their secrets. As the trial entered its third week, the prosecution called their final witness, James Mercer, Sullivan's former aide who had helped bury Elijah's body. Mercer, now gaunt and pale after months in protective custody, entered the courtroom with downcast eyes, unable to look at either Sullivan or Naomi Washington. For nearly 6 hours, Mercer detailed the events of October 23, 2009, and the days that followed. He described how Sullivan had arranged the meeting with Elijah under false pretenses, positioning 2 hired men in the parking lot. He recounted, voice sometimes breaking, how they had brought the journalist to Sullivan's townhouse, where the interrogation turned increasingly violent as Elijah refused to reveal his sources or surrender his notes. Sullivan kept saying, "You don't understand who you're dealing with," Mercer testified. He was obsessed with knowing who else Elijah had told about the financial network. When Elijah wouldn't answer, Sullivan would nod to the others, and the beating would continue. According to Mercer, the situation escalated when Elijah, bloodied but defiant, told Sullivan, "It doesn't matter what you do to me. The story will come out. I've made sure of it." That's when Sullivan lost control, Mercer said, unable to meet anyone's eyes. He grabbed a crystal award from his desk, some financial industry recognition, and struck Elijah repeatedly in the head. When he finally stopped, Elijah wasn't moving anymore. Sullivan just stood there, breathing hard, looking down at what he'd done. During cross-examination, defense attorney Hayes attempted to discredit Mercer, highlighting inconsistencies in his timeline and suggesting he was minimizing his own role to secure a lighter sentence. But Mercer's testimony, corroborated by physical evidence and other witnesses, remained largely intact. As the prosecution rested its case, Sullivan's team made a strategic shift. Rather than continue to deny his involvement entirely, they introduced a diminished capacity defense, arguing that Sullivan had been under extreme stress and had not intended to kill Elijah, that the death had resulted from a confrontation gone wrong, not premeditated murder. This pivot proved a miscalculation. It contradicted their earlier claims of Sullivan's complete innocence, confusing the jury and undermining their credibility. More critically, it opened the door for prosecutors to introduce evidence of extensive planning and cover-up efforts, strengthening the case for premeditation. After 5 weeks of testimony, closing arguments began on a sweltering August morning. The courtroom was so packed that dozens of reporters and members of the public stood along the walls, despite the judge's half-hearted attempts to limit attendance. Prosecutor Daniels addressed the jury with measured intensity, summarizing the evidence and returning to the fundamental question at the heart of the case: in our system, no one is supposed to be above the law. Not the wealthy, not the well-connected, not those with power and influence. Victor Sullivan believed differently. He believed his position and connections placed him beyond accountability, that he could silence a journalist and bury the truth along with Elijah's body. Your verdict is an opportunity to prove him wrong. Hayes delivered a passionate but ultimately desperate final plea, emphasizing reasonable doubt and suggesting that the prosecution had built a narrative around incomplete evidence. The government wants you to believe they've solved the perfect puzzle, but look closely, and you'll see the missing pieces. They're asking you to fill those gaps with speculation because they can't fill them with evidence. After 3 days of deliberation, the jury returned. As the forewoman rose to deliver the verdict, the courtroom fell into absolute silence. Even the normal creaks of the old courthouse seemed to still in anticipation. On the count of first-degree murder, we find the defendant, Victor Sullivan, guilty. The word guilty echoed through the courtroom, followed by a collective exhalation. Naomi closed her eyes, her shoulders dropping slightly as years of tension released in that single moment. Sullivan remained motionless, his expression unchanging as the forewoman continued through the list of charges: guilty of conspiracy, obstruction of justice, tampering with evidence, money laundering. 1 month later, at the sentencing hearing, Judge Margaret Callahan addressed Sullivan directly before pronouncing his punishment. Her voice, normally measured and judicial, carried an undercurrent of controlled anger that reporters would later describe as the conscience of the court speaking. Mr. Sullivan, your crimes represent an assault not just on Elijah Washington, but on the foundations of our democracy. When powerful individuals believe they can silence the press through violence, when they use their position to corrupt the very systems designed to ensure justice, they threaten everything our society stands for. The court sentences you to life imprisonment without the possibility of parole. As Sullivan was led from the courtroom, Naomi Washington stood, watching the man who had taken her brother's life disappear through the side door. Lieutenant Grace Chen, seated beside her, placed a hand on her shoulder in silent support. "It's over," Chen said quietly. Naomi shook her head. "No. Now the real work begins." In the months following Sullivan's conviction, the broader implications of the case continued to unfold. The financial network Elijah had been investigating proved more extensive than initially believed, touching political campaigns, development projects, and international transactions across multiple jurisdictions. 3 senators announced they would not seek re-election amid questions about campaign financing. A deputy director at the Treasury Department resigned. Real estate developments across the D.C. metro area faced renewed scrutiny. The 2 men who had helped Sullivan attack Elijah were identified through financial records and Mercer's testimony. One was arrested in Arizona, while the other was found dead in a motel room in New Mexico, an apparent suicide. The driver who had transported Elijah's body was granted immunity in exchange for testimony against others in the network. For Naomi Washington, the conclusion of the trial marked a transition rather than an ending. The Elijah Washington Foundation, initially created to keep her brother's case alive, evolved into an organization dedicated to protecting investigative journalists and promoting transparency in government. With substantial settlements from civil suits against Sullivan's estate and several implicated corporations, the foundation established the Elijah Washington Fellowship for Investigative Reporting, supporting journalists examining the intersection of money and power. Elijah's work didn't end with his death, Naomi explained at the fellowship's launch event, held at the Lincoln Memorial, the last place her brother had been seen alive. In many ways, it was just beginning. Through these fellowships, his commitment to truth will continue. Lieutenant Grace Chin received the department's highest commendation for her work on the case. At the ceremony, she spoke briefly about the importance of persistence in cold cases. "Time is both the enemy and ally of justice," she said. "It erases evidence but also erodes secrets. Our job is to be more patient than those who believe they've gotten away with their crimes." Marcus Reed, who had preserved Elijah's notes and continued his investigation through the Capitol Chronicle, published a book titled Silenced: The Killing of Elijah Washington and the Fight for Press Freedom. The book became a bestseller and was optioned for a film adaptation, with proceeds directed to the foundation. On the first anniversary of Sullivan's conviction, the Newsroom unveiled a permanent exhibit honoring journalists who had been killed in the pursuit of truth. Elijah's weathered messenger bag, recovered from Sullivan's estate during the investigation, occupied a central place in the display, alongside his press credentials and a recreation of his desk at the Chronicle. The exhibit included a wall of backlit text, excerpts from Elijah's notes and articles, culminating in words from his final, unpublished investigation: "The true measure of a democracy is not what powerful people can do, but what they cannot do. When wealth and influence place certain actions beyond scrutiny or consequences, democracy itself is compromised." These words became a rallying cry for a new generation of journalists inspired by Elijah's story. Applications to journalism schools increased nationwide, with many citing the Washington case as their motivation. Young reporters referred to themselves as Elijah's children, committed to the principles he had died defending. In Washington, D.C., the case prompted substantive reforms. The City Council passed the Washington Transparency Act, strengthening whistleblower protections and establishing an independent commission to oversee investigations involving political figures. The police department created a specialized unit focused on threats against journalists, with Lieutenant Chin serving as an advisor. The federal government, responding to public pressure, implemented new regulations requiring greater transparency in real estate transactions and campaign financing. These changes, while incremental, represented meaningful steps toward addressing the conditions that had allowed Sullivan's network to operate in the shadows. For the journalists who had worked alongside Elijah, his vindication brought complex emotions. They celebrated the justice finally achieved but mourned the colleague whose potential had been violently cut short. At the Capitol Chronicle, his desk, preserved for nearly a decade, was finally reassigned to a young investigative reporter selected through the Washington Fellowship Program. "This desk doesn't belong in a museum," Marcus Reed explained to the staff. "It belongs in a newsroom, being used by someone continuing Elijah's work." That's the memorial he would have wanted. The young journalist who inherited the desk, Zoe Michaels, placed a small framed photo of Elijah on the corner, a reminder of the legacy she was now part of. Her first major investigation, examining algorithmic discrimination in government service delivery, won a national award and led to legislative hearings. "I never met Elijah Washington," she said in her acceptance speech, "but I work at his desk every day, and I feel his presence in the standards we uphold and the questions we ask. His story taught me that journalism isn't just a career, it's a responsibility." As Washington, D.C. moved forward, the case continued to resonate beyond the Capitol. Law schools incorporated it into ethics curricula. Journalism programs studied both Elijah's investigative methods and the institutional failures that had initially allowed his killer to escape justice. Civil rights organizations cited the case when advocating for press protections and police reform. 5 years after Sullivan's conviction, Naomi Washington stood at Arlington National Cemetery, where Elijah had been reinterred with military honors in recognition of his service to democracy. The autumn air carried the scent of fallen leaves as she placed a single white rose on his headstone. Lieutenant Chin, now Captain Chin, joined her, as she did each year on this anniversary. The two women, once strangers united by tragedy, had become close friends through their shared journey. "I was thinking about something Elijah wrote in college," Naomi said, her breath visible in the crisp air. He said that truth is never actually buried, just waiting beneath the surface for someone committed enough to dig. Chen nodded, looking across the rolling hills of the cemetery. 9 years. Almost gave up so many times. But you didn't, Naomi replied. That made all the difference. As they walked back toward the cemetery gates, they passed a school group on a field trip. The teacher was explaining Elijah's case to the students, who listened with unusual attention for teenagers. Naomi slowed, overhearing a girl ask, "Weren't you scared to keep investigating when someone so powerful was involved?" "Of course," the teacher replied. "But as Elijah Washington showed us, courage isn't about not being afraid. It's about what you do despite your fear." Naomi and Chen exchanged a glance, continuing past without interrupting. The teacher hadn't recognized them, they were simply two women visiting the cemetery. But they carried with them the satisfaction of knowing that Elijah's story had transcended the personal tragedy of his death to become something larger, a lesson about persistence, truth, and the enduring power of justice, however delayed. The case of Elijah Washington ultimately revealed fundamental truths about American society. First, that systems designed to ensure accountability can be manipulated by those with sufficient resources and connections. The ease with which Sullivan had initially deflected suspicion and altered evidence demonstrated the advantages wealth and position provide, even in criminal matters. Second, that justice, while not inevitable, remains possible when pursued with unwavering determination. The combined persistence of a grieving sister, a dedicated detective, principled journalists, and ultimately a community unwilling to forget had overcome seemingly insurmountable obstacles. Third, that the health of a democracy depends on protecting those who question power. Elijah's death had exposed weaknesses in the systems meant to guard press freedom, leading to meaningful reforms that strengthen these protections for future generations. As twilight descended on the Capitol, the Washington Monument stood illuminated against the darkening sky, a reminder of ideals that transcend individual leaders and moments. Nearby, at the Newsom, visitors still paused at Elijah's exhibit, reading his words and reflecting on their relevance to contemporary challenges. Among them was James Mercer, released after serving his reduced sentence. Older now, face lined with the weight of what he had witnessed and participated in, he stood before the display in silence, eventually placing a hand briefly on the glass before turning away. Outside, life in Washington, D.C., continued its relentless pace. Politicians debated new legislation. Journalists chased breaking stories. Tourists photographed monuments. Yet beneath this familiar rhythm ran a deeper current, an awareness that the city's power had been held accountable, that a long-buried truth had finally emerged into the light. For those who remembered Elijah Washington, the journalist who disappeared on a rainy October night in 2009, the man whose pursuit of truth cost him his life but ultimately changed a city, his legacy was not found in exhibits or fellowships or reformed laws, though these mattered. It lived in every question asked of the powerful, every document examined for what it revealed and concealed, every story that refused to accept comfortable lies in place of uncomfortable truths. As Captain Grace Chen later wrote in her memoir, the Sullivan case taught us that justice has no expiration date. It may be delayed by power, money, and influence, but as long as someone remembers and continues to seek the truth, the possibility of justice remains alive. In a world where closure often seems elusive, this knowledge provides its own form of hope, not that every wrong will be righted, but that no wrongdoer can ever be certain they have escaped accountability. In the end, the story of Elijah Washington was not just about a murder solved or a powerful man held accountable. It was about the enduring strength of truth, how it may be temporarily buried, ignored, or denied, but never permanently erased as long as those who value it continue to dig, to question, to remember. In this perseverance lay a profound message for a nation often divided, that some principles transcend political differences, that some values unite rather than separate, that the pursuit of justice, however difficult, remains essential to who we are as a people. The story of Elijah Washington's case became a catalyst for change across American journalism. In the years following Sullivan's conviction, a quiet revolution unfolded, not with dramatic headlines, but through the gradual strengthening of institutions designed to protect press freedom and government accountability. The Washington Transparency Act, initially limited to the district, inspired similar legislation in 17 states by 2025. These laws collectively strengthened whistleblower protections, created independent oversight bodies for political investigations, and established dedicated resources for cases involving threats to journalists. Perhaps most significantly, the Sullivan case prompted a national conversation about the intersection of wealth, power, and justice. Congressional hearings in 2023 examined how financial influence affected democratic institutions, using Elijah's murder as a case study in the dangers of unchecked corruption. What happened to Elijah Washington represents a systemic failure, not an isolated incident, testified Professor Diana Ramirez, a legal scholar specializing in democratic governance. The ease with which a powerful individual could orchestrate both a murder and its cover-up reveals vulnerabilities in our institutions that must be addressed. These hearings resulted in the Journalistic Protection Act, federal legislation establishing enhanced penalties for crimes against reporters and creating a rapid response protocol for threats against media workers. The bill, which passed with rare bipartisan support, was signed into law on the 15th anniversary of Elijah's disappearance. At the signing ceremony, Naomi Washington stood in the Oval Office, watching as the president applied his signature to legislation bearing her brother's invisible imprint. The journey from grief-stricken sister to nationally recognized advocate had transformed her in ways she never anticipated. "Elijah would be shocked to see me here," she told reporters afterward, a small smile softening her usually serious expression. "He was always the one comfortable in the spotlight, asking the tough questions. I just wanted to practice law quietly. But his story taught me that sometimes silence isn't an option." By 2025, the Elijah Washington Foundation had grown into a powerful force for journalistic freedom. With offices in Washington, D.C., New York, and Los Angeles, the foundation provided legal support for investigative reporters facing intimidation, funded research on emerging threats to press freedom, and operated a rapid response network for journalists in crisis situations around the world. Each year, the foundation hosted the Washington Symposium, bringing together journalists, legal experts, and public officials to assess the state of press freedom. The event concluded with the presentation of the Elijah Washington Award for Courage in Reporting, recognizing journalists who pursued truth despite significant personal risk. The 2025 symposium marked a special milestone, the presentation of the first Elijah Washington Medal of Freedom, a new presidential honor created to recognize civilians who had made extraordinary contributions to transparency and accountability in government. The inaugural recipient was Captain Grace Chen, recently retired from the Metropolitan Police Department after a distinguished career. The East Room of the White House filled with dignitaries as the president described Chen's unwavering 16-year commitment to solving Elijah's case. Captain Chen's persistence reminds us that justice may be delayed, but it need not be denied. When institutions fail, individuals of conscience and courage can still prevail. As Chen accepted the medal, her customary reserve momentarily gave way to visible emotion. "This recognition belongs not just to me, but to everyone who refused to let Elijah Washington's story end with his disappearance. His case taught me that time doesn't diminish the importance of truth, it magnifies it." The ceremony represented more than personal recognition for Chen, it symbolized a cultural shift in how America viewed the relationship between journalism and democracy. Attacks on reporters, once sometimes dismissed as occupational hazards or partisan issues, were increasingly recognized as assaults on fundamental democratic principles. This shift manifested in concrete ways across the country. The Sullivan investigation had exposed specific vulnerabilities in how financial crimes were investigated, leading to the creation of specialized units within the FBI and Justice Department focused on complex money laundering schemes. These units employed forensic accountants, data analysts, and investigators with expertise in following financial trails across jurisdictional boundaries. One such unit, established in 2024, bore the unofficial nickname Elijah's Division among its members. Within 2 years, it had successfully prosecuted 3 major cases involving political corruption and financial crimes that might previously have gone undetected or unpunished. What changed wasn't just resources or methods, explained Special Agent Talia Rodriguez, who led the division. It was perspective. The Washington case taught us to look beyond individual suspicious transactions to see the larger patterns of influence they create. When money moves in certain ways, it's not just about profit, it's about power. In journalism schools across the country, Elijah's case became a core component of ethics and investigative reporting curricula. Students analyzed his methods, discussed the risks he faced, and debated how similar investigations might be conducted in the digital age. His approach to source protection and documentation served as a model for aspiring journalists navigating increasingly complex threats. At Georgetown University, where Elijah had studied journalism, an annual lecture series brought leading investigative reporters to campus to share their experiences and insights. The series, endowed by the Washington Foundation, culminated each year with the presentation of the Elijah Washington Scholarship to a student demonstrating exceptional promise in investigative reporting. The 2025 lecture featured Zoe Michaels, now an established investigative journalist whose work on algorithmic discrimination had expanded into a comprehensive examination of how technology was reshaping governance and accountability. When I started at the Capitol Chronicle, sitting at Elijah's desk felt overwhelming, she told the packed auditorium. How do you follow someone who gave everything for the truth? Eventually, I realized that's exactly the wrong question. We don't follow Elijah. We continue his work, asking different questions in different times but with the same commitment to holding power accountable. Michael's words reflected a broader understanding that had emerged about Elijah's legacy. He was no longer just a martyr for press freedom but a symbol of the ongoing, collective responsibility to question authority and expose corruption. His story had transcended the specifics of his life and death to become a touchstone for democratic values in action. This transformation was perhaps most visible in how Washington, D.C. itself had changed. The city, once infamous for its insider culture and revolving doors between government and industry, had implemented some of the nation's strictest ethics and transparency requirements. Officials who might once have moved seamlessly between regulatory positions and the entities they regulated now faced meaningful restrictions and scrutiny. The corner of Constitution Avenue and 23rd Street, near where Elijah's car was last captured on camera, had been renamed Elijah Washington Way. A small plaque explained his story to tourists and reminded locals of the price sometimes paid for uncovering uncomfortable truths. Not everyone embraced these changes. Some politicians and business leaders complained that increased transparency requirements hampered efficiency and decision-making. Certain financial institutions relocated operations to jurisdictions with less rigorous oversight. But supporters argued that these were signs the reforms were working. Discomfort among the powerful often preceded meaningful accountability. In 2026, these tensions came to a head when a major investigation inspired by Elijah's methods exposed a contemporary corruption scheme involving defense contracts and offshore accounts. The investigation, conducted by a team at the Capitol Chronicle led by Zoe Michaels, traced how military procurement decisions had been influenced by hidden financial relationships between Pentagon officials and defense contractors. The resulting scandal led to 11 indictments, including 2 senior Defense Department officials and executives at 3 major corporations. The evidence was so compelling that several defendants pleaded guilty rather than face trial, providing information that expanded the investigation further. For Marcus Reed, now publisher of the Capitol Chronicle, the case represented a full-circle moment. 17 years ago, Elijah was killed for investigating financial corruption at the highest levels. Today, we continue that work in an environment where such investigations are better protected, though never completely safe. The defense contract investigation demonstrated both how much had changed since Elijah's death and how much remained vulnerable. The journalists received threats, and one reporter's home was vandalized. But unlike in 2009, these incidents triggered immediate protective measures under the Journalistic Protection Act, including FBI involvement, security assessments, and enhanced monitoring of potential threats. The difference isn't that powerful people no longer try to silence journalists, Michaels explained during a panel discussion at the Washington Foundation. It's that when they do, they face a coordinated response from law enforcement, media organizations, and civil society. The isolation that made Elijah vulnerable has been replaced by networks of protection. Victor Sullivan, meanwhile, continued serving his life sentence at a federal penitentiary in Colorado. In 2025, a new administration's Justice Department reviewed his case as part of a broader examination of high-profile convictions, confirming that the evidence supported his continued incarceration. Sullivan had exhausted his appeals by 2028, each attempt to overturn his conviction rejected by increasingly higher courts. In prison, Sullivan became an object of academic study. Researchers in criminal psychology examined how someone with his background and advantages had justified actions that so fundamentally violated societal norms. Several published papers analyzed the Sullivan syndrome, defined as the psychological state in which power and influence create a sense of exemption from ordinary moral and legal constraints. For Sullivan himself, the years brought gradual but visible deterioration. Prison photos showed a man who had aged far beyond his years, his once confident posture now stooped, his expression haunted. He declined most interview requests but occasionally spoke with religious counselors, reportedly expressing conflicted feelings about his actions and their consequences. In a rare public statement issued through his attorney in 2027, Sullivan acknowledged his role in Elijah's death while continuing to characterize it as an unplanned escalation rather than premeditated murder. The statement, widely interpreted as positioning for clemency consideration, was met with public skepticism and formal opposition from the Washington Foundation. Naomi Washington responded with characteristic directness. Acknowledgement without full accountability is merely strategy, not remorse. My brother cannot speak his truth, so I will continue to speak it for him. By 2030, as Washington, D.C., passed the 21st anniversary of Elijah's disappearance, the case had become woven into the city's identity and America's understanding of press freedom. School children learned about Elijah alongside historical figures who had shaped the nation's commitment to the First Amendment. Law enforcement academies used the case to teach the importance of persistence in cold cases and the dangers of allowing influence to affect investigations. That October, a new permanent exhibit opened at the Smithsonian National Museum of American History, titled The Fourth Estate: Journalism and Democracy in America. Elijah's story occupied a central place in the modern section, with interactive displays allowing visitors to explore how his investigation had unfolded and how its resolution had influenced subsequent legislation and practices. At the exhibit's opening, Captain Grace Chen, now in her 60s but still possessing the focused intensity that had characterized her throughout the investigation, reflected on the case's lasting impact. When I first reviewed Elijah's file, it was just one of dozens of unsolved cases on my desk, she told the gathered crowd. I couldn't have imagined it would eventually change how we understand the relationship between power and accountability in this country. That transformation began with one journalist asking uncomfortable questions and continued through years of collective effort to ensure those questions didn't die with him. The exhibit included a recreation of Elijah's desk at the Capitol Chronicle, complete with period-accurate computer, notebooks, and coffee mug. Nearby, a digital display tracked the implementation of press protection measures across the country, showing how the Washington Transparency Act had inspired similar legislation nationwide. Most powerfully, the exhibit featured testimonials from journalists who had benefited from protections established in Elijah's wake. Their stories, of threats detected and neutralized, of investigations completed despite intimidation, of accountability achieved against powerful interests, formed a living testament to how institutional reforms sparked by one case had created ripples of change throughout American journalism. Elijah never sought to be a symbol, Naomi Washington said at the conclusion of the opening ceremony. He was a journalist doing his job with integrity and courage. But symbols matter. They remind us of what we value and what we must protect. My brother's legacy is not just about remembering what happened to him, but ensuring it doesn't happen to others pursuing the truth. As visitors moved through the exhibit in the days and weeks that followed, many paused at a simple display near the exit, a floor-to-ceiling photograph of the Lincoln Memorial at night, rain-slicked steps gleaming under monument lights. It was taken on October 23, 2009, the night Elijah disappeared, by a tourist who had no idea they were capturing the beginning of a story that would eventually change a nation's understanding of press freedom. Beside the photo, illuminated text presented Elijah's own words from a college essay found among his personal papers, democracy requires not just the right to speak truth, but the determination to seek it. Without that commitment, freedom of the press remains merely theoretical, a principle honored in law but abandoned in practice. These words, written when Elijah was barely 20, had proven prophetic. His life had demonstrated the courage required to seek truth, his death had revealed the price sometimes paid for that determination, and the 2 decades since had shown how a society could respond, not with resignation, but with renewed commitment to protecting those who ask difficult questions of the powerful. In cities across America, journalism experienced a renaissance born partly from Elijah's story. Young reporters cited him as inspiration for entering a profession often characterized by low pay and increasing risk. Non-profit investigative newsrooms flourished, supported by foundations and individual donors who recognized that democracy required independent watchdogs. The Washington Foundation expanded its mission to include support for local news organizations, establishing matching grant programs that helped community papers survive the digital transition while maintaining their watchdog function. These efforts acknowledged that national cases like Elijah's began with local reporting and that democracy depended on informed citizens at every level. As 2030 drew to a close, the Foundation published 20 years later, The Elijah Washington Case in American Democracy, a comprehensive report examining how press freedom and accountability mechanisms had evolved since 2009. The report identified both progress and persistent challenges, acknowledging that the work of protecting journalistic independence remained unfinished. What Elijah's case taught us, the report concluded, is that democracy is not self-sustaining. It requires constant vigilance, institutional safeguards, and individuals willing to risk comfort, and sometimes safety, to uphold its principles. The question for the next 20 years is whether we will continue to learn from this lesson or allow complacency to erode the protections built in its wake. For those who had known Elijah personally, the 20-year milestone brought both satisfaction and melancholy. Marcus Reed, now in his 70s, visited Arlington National Cemetery on the anniversary of Elijah's disappearance, placing a copy of the day's Capitol Chronicle beside the white rose Naomi had left earlier. "We're still asking the tough questions, Elijah," he said quietly. "Still making powerful people uncomfortable. That's how we honor you." As Reed turned to leave, he noticed a young woman standing nearby, observing with respectful distance. He recognized her as a recent hire at the Chronicle, part of the new generation of journalists who knew Elijah only as history and inspiration. "Mr. Reed," she said, approaching hesitantly. "I just wanted to say thank you. For keeping his story alive all those years. For showing us what journalism is supposed to be." Reed nodded, unable to speak for a moment. "Finally," he said, "just keep asking the questions that need asking. That's all any of us can do." As they walked together toward the cemetery gates, Reed found himself thinking about the nature of legacy. Elijah Washington had lived just 29 years. But his impact continued to expand through time, through laws bearing his invisible influence, through institutions shaped by his story, and through journalists who carried forward his commitment to truth. It wasn't the legacy Elijah would have chosen. Given the choice, he would surely have preferred a long life of reporting, perhaps eventually mentoring younger journalists and reflecting on a career of meaningful work. But the legacy he received, of catalyzing a renewed commitment to press freedom and democratic accountability, was perhaps more far-reaching than anything he might have accomplished in a single lifetime of reporting. In Washington, D.C., as dusk fell on another October 23, the Lincoln Memorial glowed against the darkening sky. Tourists climbed its steps, taking photos and reading the inscribed words of another American whose life had been cut short but whose legacy had transformed the nation. Among them moved ordinary citizens and aspiring journalists, government officials and corporate executives, each carrying their own relationship to power and truth. Some would uphold Elijah's values, others might someday test the protections established in his name. But all lived in a democracy marginally strengthened by the story of one reporter who asked the wrong questions of the wrong people, in the 2 decades of reckoning that followed. As Captain Chen had observed years earlier, justice sometimes arrives late, but its delayed appearance makes it no less transformative when it finally emerges from darkness into light. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out. And don't forget to subscribe and turn on the notification bell so you don't miss any upload from us.